I'm going to talk about a model that has been recently developed through quite a lot of efforts. It's, I think, 4 PhD dissertations, plus collaboration with Tsinghua University, and these are the authors that I acknowledge. They have all put in quite a lot of effort, and also there's funding both in Cambridge and in China to do it. So what I'm saying is my own view. So you can criticize me, and I like actually the kind of style that there's a kind of, I'd like to hear actually what you think about this one. And now, the global context of the modeling work in Beijing is really the elephant in the room. And essentially, at the moment, we have, is that about 4 billion people and in the cities, and then 2.5 billion is going to be added, and that's the UN data to the left, between now and between 2014 and 2050. Now, the issue is that 3 billion, or probably slightly more, will be in the low or middle income countries. Beijing is among probably the most proactive in terms of infrastructure planning and data provision. However, good data is very hard to find. So if you complain about data in the United States and Europe, then what you see there is not going to be up to scratch. Although people still do population synthesizing, right? So there are people who do this. Now, the other element, which is also a barrier to implementation of models, is that the policy decision cycles were so fast. Usually, a revision of a master plan of a city would take about 3 months, sometimes actually say 1 month. I think last night actually I heard someone saying it could be as fast as that. So this is really the context. I really would like more people in the academic community and the professional community to work on these cities, because this is where the most urgent needs are. And all the things that actually people worry about in the developed world about carbon emission and resource consumption in general will be completely rendered into irrelevance if this other question, the 3+2 question, 3 current billion of urban population plus 2 billion coming into the city in the next 40 years is going to be the challenge. Now, in terms of the context of the model building, I'll mention 4 points as a kind of a context. The first point is to do with the fast and slow changes. The fast is that Beijing, over the period of 2000 to 2010, population growth was something like 5% a year, right? So, and well, that's according to the official figures. It may be higher. So currently, the Beijing municipality within its boundaries was something like 22 million people, but according to alternative analysis, it could be a lot more. It's probably about 30 million in total now. And so the growth rate is far higher than what has been recorded, for example, in London or Paris during the Industrial Revolution. However, in terms of traffic and congestion and things of that sort, and you see some very gentle changes, right? So this is very much a sign of a chronic disease rather than a precipitous one. And the average commuting distance, which is the black line to the left, is going up, and the commuting time is going up as well. So implying that the travel speeds on average of many, many things, right, over this period has not radically changed. Now, of course, because there are fast changes, so actually there are also very drastic measures. The major events over this period, which is not reflected in these tables, are the building of infrastructure for the Beijing Olympics 2008, and also after 2008, the restriction of 20% of cars per working day based on number plate numbers, right? There are these wider and possibly wilder land use transport interaction questions. Of course, this is the transformative phase of cities. And the left graph is the data hot off the press from the Beijing Transport Research Center, now rebranded as Beijing Transport Institute, which actually gets all the good transport data. So if people say the monitor data is not there, that's because they have all covered it under their bushel. So it's not that it's not there, but actually there's a huge amount. They do these indices. Essentially, the middle part is what they consider to be acceptable speed, right? These are the it's called the traffic congestion index. Between 4 and 6 is what they think is acceptable. And over this period of 2010 to 2014, the index actually hardly changed, although actually there was a lot more traffic actually added to it. Of course, now, the gridlock situation is prevented by a whole host of adaptations. And if any one of these is really helpful to, really interesting academically to model, but there's no time really to model them. Now, in terms of the measures taken, essentially, you could see that between 2005 and 2010, this is part of the fast changes, the total vehicles in dark green has doubled, right? So private cars has more than tripled, and therefore in 2011, somewhere around here, a lottery for car purchase certificates have been been put in, therefore the growth has been slowed down to that, right? So this is not just because people are now conscious that they're driving cars that are bad for the environment, because they're controlling for that, but these are the municipal registration, and over the border, outside Beijing, the cars are not restricted, and those areas are developing very fast. I'll come back to that in a minute. The third point is that when you talk to the practitioners and master planners and transport planners in Beijing, they're very, very intelligent people. And well, whatever model insights that you give them is not quite enough, because they ask for more, and a lot more. And what they really want, because I'm doing currently a project there using this model, is that they want to know what is what would be the appropriate land use mix, what would be the built form, density, and also the timing of development in roads and public transport capacities. And of course, the land use mix and built form was very much the story, which is the wider story of transport, land use transport interaction. This is the old story of Luti. And the new question really is to do with the kind of queues that on a new metro station, right? So as soon as the metro lines open, it's already over capacity. So clearly, land use transport are not coordinated. The local planners felt embarrassed that the plans actually didn't work out. Partly it's the fault of the the transport-only models, I must say. But there's also the wider institutional question of actually who is doing what and whether the left hand and right hand actually know what they're doing. And what they want to do is to know how much more to build and also how much capacity to reserve in these corridors. Because Beijing, as in many other countries, is fast improving its incomes. NIMBYism is coming in, and building roads is now very difficult, just like in any developed country cities. And building metro is also very difficult, right? Even actually tunneling, actually, there's NIMBYism everywhere against it. And finally, in terms of the context, the project that they're planning is very, very ambitious and includes radio fast roads everywhere. So these actually you can get from government documents. And you can also get new lines to be built. For example, there's a line going down here and possibly extended for 50 kilometers to the new airport. The current airport, one terminal is equivalent to the whole of Heathrow, and I think this year reaching 90 million passengers per year, and the even bigger one is built here, and is currently being built. However, if you want to say, okay, I'll model for you for 2030, give me all the transport projects you're considering, then you don't get it. Because, well, a lot of projects are being thought about, but actually they turn the question around and say, you are the wise guys, you tell me actually where to build, right? So your model is supposed to tell us that. Now, in terms of our own underlying model, we do it now in two parts. This is very much the Martin Center tradition that David is also part of. The first part is that we have now revamped this model to be a spatial equilibrium model of land use activities, which is aimed to model the short and medium-term adaptations of working residents which are in the labor market, their families, and their choices of where to locate, how to travel, and where to get services, and also the jobs that they go to. And the underlying model is very similar to the Raluchan model that Alex, Anas, and colleagues have developed over the years. And so these are the kind of new economic metric equations that have been put in, which we could, I'll have a slide later. And a second part is an expansion of the Lowry model tradition, the true Lowry model tradition, where the models are not simply a general equilibrium model. And one of the Achilles heels of the Alex Anas model, and this I have discussed with Alex, was that it would know what the equilibrium state will be, but it will not know when the city will reach that state. Right? So for planning models which will have timing questions included in that, that's not helpful. But the true Lowry tradition actually does give you the dates. This is not just us doing it, because actually lots of people have done that. But what we have done was also to absorb the kind of insights that have been developed by Michael Wegner in Airport, David Simmons in Delta, and Paul Wedell in Urban Sim, and accepting that the property development, the relocation of the non-commuter households, and the changes in transport infrastructure and services and so on will be lumpy, and also will be not in equilibrium in any sense of the word. So it's probably helpful to actually quickly go through actually what we had before as a MePlan model. And of course, MePlan is versatile. You can actually develop all sorts of models that actually still currently being used. as a transport model in the national transport model in the UK. But for a typical land use and transport interaction model application, for example, for London or for Cambridge or for Chile or for lots of places, it's driven by jobs. So here is where in the workplace, first actually the model is told actually where people will be working, and then the model derives the demand for labor in the workplace, and that's through commuting and endogenously modeled to generate the residents. This is just to actually, just to get my narrative. I'm pretty sure that I think majority of you actually already know about this. And then these commuter residents actually form households, and we call it households with an employed person, and that derives housing demand, and that's compared with housing supply. Of course, the households outside the labor market also does that. And then through persons, we generate the demand for travel, and the means to derive the travel is to link to actually what is based on the purposes of that end of the journey, like what Kai actually mentioned. Of course, that adds to the demand for workforce, and that's also a famous Lowry loop. And then that's generated in the workplace the demand for business floor space, business trips from home, and commuting in and outside area, and so on. And this is the new platform that we have, and we have now rebranded the Louisa model, and the first version was actually created by Marcio Echenique himself in the 2013 paper, and since then we have actually revamped many of these links. The particularly notable ones would be the links of a double link, both from jobs to residents, and also from residents to jobs. Essentially, this links back is a kind of feedback of the stickiness of the location of the residences nowadays, particularly in higher income areas where jobs are then attracted. Another notable change was to do with freight and logistics and so on. And of course, these red ones are to do with the recursive models I've just mentioned. And this is probably too small for you to see, but what I want to say is that for Kai, that agglomeration index is part of the equation, which is additional to what Alex has in ReloTran, but otherwise it's a Cobb-Douglas CES function, and which is capable of modeling different varieties of inputs, including labor, including floor space, including raw materials and services and so on. And in addition, this on the household side is a fuller utility function, which now converges with the economist models. Actually, the convergence actually was us meeting the economists in the middle. In June, in the summer, we had a conference with quite a lot of economists, including Esteban Rossi Hansberg, whom some of you may know. And what they're saying is that they now include these location-specific constants, actually, to model the part of the unabsorbed, the part of the utility that is not represented explicitly by the various cost terms. And then they realized, actually, we've been doing that for years and years. But what we have learned from them was more of this, the use of the CES function, especially the version that has got input-specific parameters actually in the CS function. In terms of the structure of the model, then this is too small for you to read. Essentially, we use the recursive dynamic models for floor space, the non-employed households, and transport networks and so on, to drive as a kind of a boundary condition, drive these spatial equilibrium models, and within them, of course, we are capable of including the labor markets, the product markets, business floor space demand, housing demand, various markets you can do. And as much as possible, that is capable of reaching equilibrium within the period between 5 to 10 years. And then we do this from period to period. So this is very much an aggregate model tradition. You might find it boring, so you may criticize it. So this is our conscious decision of pursuing these actually quite broad brush models. In terms of calibration, what we do was to first to use the observed data sets, typically from 2 time periods, usually the census cross-sections in Beijing. This means 2000 and 2010. We calibrate a recursive non-equilibrium model between that period, and also we calibrate the spatial equilibrium model for each of the cross-sections, and we link to them and compare with the observed data. And in the future, this is run similarly so that, for example, the spatial equilibrium model for 2010 will provide inputs to the recursive model for 2020, and that further drives, as part of the boundary condition of the spatial equilibrium model for 2020 and so on. So in Beijing, we have set up this system so that it's a 10-year cycle in line with their 5-year plans, right? So usually the officials, especially officials at the Politburo level, are appointed for 2 plan periods. So actually it's a 10-year period. This is the Beijing-Tianjin-Hebei megacity region. I call it the Megachora. And already over 100 million people over an area which is slightly bigger than Great Britain, right? So this is about, the whole of that is 280,000 square kilometers, while England is probably just about 200, right? So at that level. To annoy quite a lot of the modelers, so actually we use all these zones. Actually, the whole of this area, we only use 209 zones, with Beijing 130. And these are also quite conscious decisions. And also, we have already reached the very limit of the data that they have either internal or publicly available. So that's the kind of data that we can get. Of course, there are 2 new things that we have done that are new. One is that for 1 period only, in 2008, we have a publicly available data set of taxi GPS traces. It's very buggy and it needs a lot of cleaning. Once we've done it, we were able to derive fairly good congested speeds for this network over the whole of the area inside Ring 5, which is the main urban area where congestion occurs. And so this is one piece of data where we have got congested speeds for a period near one of our base years. And with that, we then derived the base year speeds, congested speeds for 2000 and 2010, the two calibration cross sections. And another thing is from this estate agent website, we actually have obtained information of the rents for the core urban area, and with assumptions about the rest, we infill the data to show how much the rents are. So these are essentially two observed equilibrium states for the transport and the housing markets, and we treasure them because they help us to calibrate models. Once we've gone through all that model structure and modeled all of that interaction between land use and transport, in the transport we also have a multimodal model which used congested speeds without iteration to get a good fit in terms of the travel demand using synthesized demand matrices, synthesized and full demand matrices, and we're able to get a pretty good fit. And with that, then we also define different sort of built form areas. There's a central city, there's a near suburbs, and there are these new towns and the far suburbs, and the ecological protection areas with different kind of propensity for different sorts of built forms and so on. So this actually, this kind of land use classification, again very broad brush, were put into the boundary conditions for forecasting. Another thing which may be controversial here is that we have assumed that in the future years, from 2020 onwards, the zone-to-zone travel speed will remain the same as the 2008 speed that we have got. So it is a level of congestion before the Olympics, and citizens are particularly content with that period because the roads are built and the car ownership levels have not increased to actually fill the roads. So that was the period we have assumed as our base case of projections. So actually we assume these speeds will be maintained through all those adaptations I mentioned earlier. Of course, you can also do that for other types of assumptions. For example, here we have actually shown a proposal to develop a new railway line, suburban rail, and which will increase speeds along this corridor. And you can do this either by destination, origin, or whatever combination, right? And with those, so then we carry out a number of forecasts. So this is the baseline forecast in terms of predicted housing in the floor space in the future using the non-equilibrium recursive dynamic model. And this is then in turn becomes the inputs into the predictions of the locations of the jobs and the residents. And in the workplace zone, we can predict the amount of output using the production functions and also the economic mass and agglomeration effects and productivity. And in the residential zones, then we divide them into low, medium, and high income households and look at their levels of utility. And the kind of applications that I will not have time to address them in any detail. So what I show here is, for example, one set of applications we had looking at the trend growth, which is essentially the city expanding into the current second designated green belt, eventually filling this area with development, a strict control of the green belt between 2010 and 2030, or actually green wedges where you see real focused development. So this side actually we link to some of the projects that you considered considering in North America and Europe. And the current project we're doing is for a sub-center about 25 kilometers from the center of the Forbidden City here, potentially covering an area which is about the same size as the existing city, as you can see. This is still under wraps, so I cannot actually talk anything about it. To summarize, the first point is that these regions are really large, possibly with parallel worlds, with the low-income people remaining low-income for many decades, while there's a middle class burgeoning in these areas. The model predictions are urgently needed and necessarily for a period of 20 to 30 years in time scale for land use and transport interaction coordination to come to fruition. This is the kind of scale that is considered necessary because the next 10 years is already fixed in official plans, right? But the condition is that it's with very little data and very little idea of existing infrastructure plans. And of course, the current trends are not boding well, as I've just said. The question is that for these megachoras in the developing world, can they achieve the same or better accessibility and mobility while transforming the patterns of development? A possible new approach here we're using, maybe actually others have been using this approach as well, is to actually to detach more of these two models so that we can make certain assumptions about the prognosis of traffic congestion into the future, assuming that certain policies will actually be implemented, right? In answer to Rolf's questions, actually Rolf has this list of questions, and the first one is to do with the agent level microscopic integration. Yes, we very much like it, so long as these insights could be used for aggregate models from my own point of view. The second question is to do with what information can be exchanged. So I've already made it simpler, probably too simple for the exchange in terms of travel costs and times. But I think what is most critical, and I think this probably I rely on you as a microscopic modelers actually to get the land use part of the model to tell the transport model much more about the nature of the land use and build form. For example, this will help to improve the car ownership forecast in the land transport model, as well as travel demand predictions. So that is very important. I'm assuming that in microscopic simulation, then the personal characteristics is already passed on anyway. How can we deal with different timescales of ad hoc choices and the long-term transport choices, and perhaps a combination of the dynamic non-equilibrium models with spatial equilibrium models, which are, I think, still key in economic assessment. What is right balance between detail and reasonable times? In Cambridge, we consider that the models should be about a couple of hours to run, because the poor student will have to run it thousands of times, right? So actually to get it to do, but and there may be other views, right? So, and finally, are these additional tools useful? Yes, absolutely. But I think in order for them to become useful, in the transformative phase of city development, which will be the majority of cities in the world, I think gaming between stakeholders is an absolute requirement. I think I hope that more discussions will take place. Thank you.
Thank you, Ying, for this presentation. We have a few minutes for discussion on this topic. Any comments, any feedback? Kai?
I think it's very adventurous to assume that 2008 congestion still holds in 2016. Now, the question I have was, Beijing has started to adopt Singapore-style restrictions on car ownership. And my question is, how can your model include those? Or the other way around, can your model tell the Beijing authorities how strongly they would need to limit the car growth or actually shrink it again? And the second question is, to what extent are you addressing the air quality problems which Beijing has? Because from what I understand, and it's very little, is that the population of Beijing doesn't want to live in the air they are breathing. So is there any attempt in your model to address that question? And then obviously the related question, because if the industries get shut down, where would the people go? What flood of population would kind of leave the overall area? So what is the interaction you assume there?
People living in there. Yeah, and so 3 questions. And the first one, I had actually this interesting dinner with the transport chief in 2008, just before he implemented this scheme. And the question asked was whether in his travels he has actually seen a successful example where car restrictions actually have become a good solution. He said no. And he said he has not seen such a solution. This is going to be temporary, but if he couldn't do it, he'll lose his job.
That hasn't stopped Beijing from limiting car growth quite severely.
That's true. But the official view is still that at some stage they will have to abandon this. Sadly. This person has since become the Deputy Minister of Transport in the national government. And so at the moment they are looking at parking, right? So I think that's probably a sensible thing to do. And there are these considerations. But to answer your question in the slightly oblique way, what is on the cards in China is that brute force is on the agenda. If a gentle demand management approach doesn't work, a more brutal approach can be taken, and it probably will be taken. To combine with your question about air quality, what I think we could look at would probably be more like solutions like in Hong Kong or Tokyo, where to make cars both very expensive and very slow in the areas people concentrate. Air quality questions, the contribution of air pollution from transport is quite small. And the bulk of that is to do with rural enterprises burning coal outside Beijing. And Beijing actually has been transformed into a city supported by natural gas for good and for ill, right? So natural gas is very valuable in China, so only Beijing people are actually allowed to use it. And outside Beijing, in Hebei, that's why this is the wider area we're modeling. And here, you're absolutely correct that it's to do with the wider industrial restructuring And this is taking place. And I think the various officials realize that over their tenure, if they could not make a good improvement, they're going to lose their jobs before their tenure finishes. So at the moment, very drastic approaches of closing down factories that burn coal. And well, like I said, Beijing is an unfortunate area where weather conditions actually make it worse in that area. So I think the central government actually have been taking these actions. This also means that the wider socio-economic dynamics in these areas is very important. So I half-jokingly said to some of the officials that they should actually spread the property bubble into Hebei, which is the province, and which actually gives them a cash machine locally to do some things and also actually to get them out of this. Of course, currently the problem is that they have already built too much, and that actually stock is not being digested, right? So I think Kelly probably have seen this. So the question is that through effective spatial equilibrium, how this actually could be spread. So Beijing clearly is overheating, and this is actually suffers this kind of a growth area problems, just like any other city in the world.
Just more of a comment.
Yeah.
I wouldn't recommend the Chinese to follow the British example of excessively relying on the housing market to drive their economy.
No, well, they realized this, and in fact, actually recently shooting their own foot financially by limiting the housing bubble. And I think Kelly actually have seen some of this stuff already. Probably other colleagues have done the same. And they realized that. But on the other hand, all the money that has been used to build the 1,000 kilometers of metro in Beijing came from this source. And so, of course, it's not sustainable, and how this is going to work out next, I don't know, because today I got the news that the young girl is now in Beijing talking to young girl, the Danish professor of urban design, and talking to the deputy minister of construction, actually, to do something. But without this, the wider picture, they are not going to be able to succeed, because they can't actually get people into the city to dance on the beautiful pavements that the young girl wants to build. And I think that's the issue here. So the wider issue the government are addressing, but also we have tested scenarios to suburbanize further into these areas. Some of these issues are completely out of the hands, our collective hands, because it's all to do with land law and the land regulations, ownership, and so on. So, and that is a side which actually has not featured in here, and nor do I think actually it's central to this particular workshop, but I think it is important both in China and elsewhere, because not only is a question of whether people can own properties, and it is also a question of where the money for development is going to come from. And so I think these are quite huge questions. I think we should link or loosely couple models that help us to do it, right? So our own models here is not going to do much of that. So what I'm now doing is actually looking at other economic models, actually to loosely couple. In fact, after this, tomorrow I'm traveling back to Beijing just for the weekend to, there is a workshop there also to talk about this, and just precisely on that issue.
All right, thank you very much, Jing.
Yeah. Thank you.